My guest today is Doug Hubbard of Hubbard Decision Research. Doug is the author of several books, among them How to Measure Anything, Finding the Value of Intangibles in Business, The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It. Doug developed a fascinating framework called Applied Information Economics that we'll be digging into today. Doug, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to be digging into and celebrating AIE, Applied Information Economics, today, which is a very rich set of ideas. And I see this kind of, generally speaking, as how to make people make vastly better decisions in conditions of uncertainty. One of the things that occurred to me, though, as I was reading through all your material, is that a lot of big decisions are made by organizations, which, of course, has an individual decision maker, which we can touch on as well. But organizations tend to process information to make decisions using other means than just, hey, is this a technically correct thing in the mind of one person? They're political decisions. And in some ways, I think a new framework, an unfamiliar framework for ideas within an organizational decision-making process could almost be seen as a threat, right? Where, you have this new information, this new way of making decisions. And I think that the way in which that would present itself to you probably is that it's a consulting project where you would recommend a decision, or they would recommend a decision with your help, would just get killed silently and just wouldn't get made, even though it seemed obvious that it should be made, and you have no outcome in the end. And I'm wondering if you have an experience of this kind of like irrational resistance from an organization to your work.
Well, I've had several federal government projects, and so there's a whole other set of reasons why sometimes they follow through with a recommendation or don't. But actually, I find it useful information by itself. One of my earliest clients was actually an insurance company that was going through a merger. And I had done a risk return analysis on the development of this major new piece of software for the organization. And in the risk analysis, and we measured benefits and all this sort of other, the cost and the duration and the things that might happen during and after a merger. And we ended up saying, look, there's just too much risk before the merger. You should wait until after the merger because we've looked at the data, and the chance of cancellation of major projects after a merger is pretty high. So why not defer this? So after all of this analysis, we said, well, your main risk is just that after a merger, when they consolidate systems, they end up canceling this. And they said, well, thank you very much, but we're going to go ahead with this anyway. And then, of course, after the merger, the project was canceled. And they had spent an extra few $1 million between the time I made that recommendation and the time it was actually canceled. So in some ways, I see it as an opportunity. People always ask, but how do you know what would have happened otherwise if they didn't follow your recommendation? Well, we have a few data points on that. So we have some situations where people did something otherwise. We try to take advantage of that, actually, and say what did happen after they didn't follow our recommendations. It seems more often than not, what's interesting is that they go ahead with a large project that we recommended against, as opposed to the other way around. Sometimes we end up recommending they do something that they end up not doing. But actually, it's the former more often, it seems. We do some analysis on a big investment initiative. Could be civil engineering projects, could be software projects, new technology, R&D. And we say, don't do it or defer it or wait until these conditions arise. They go ahead and do it.
So what is the default model they're using, do you think? Why do they make that? What is driving that decision?
Well, I think in some cases, frankly, it's and I should state that most of the time clients actually follow our recommendations. But
well, that's why they brought you in, was for your recommendation.
Yeah,
so you think that they would follow it?
They actually do have a dilemma. They don't know what the best strategy might be. They have difficulty measuring things, and they want to know. And these are the people making the decisions and writing the checks, and they would like to reduce their uncertainty and make a better bet. So those are the clients that are more likely to follow through with actual decisions. But sometimes, and all management consultants know this, a client brings you in because they kind of made up their mind already, and they're pretty sure that a consultant will agree with them.
Okay, interesting.
And
so they want to bolster their case.
Yeah, and they're surprised sometimes in the findings that the consultant does not agree with them.
Right.
So I've always said, look, my customers are the ones that actually want to know the answer. There's a lot of firms you can hire if you just want someone to agree with you. But if they actually want to make better bets, make better decisions, and serve their customers, their investors, their employees better, the general public, if you're a government agency, if you want to serve them better, you want to, have less uncertainty in your decisions in strategic ways.
So there's an idea I want to get right on the table right away, which is, I mean, in a list of profound ideas that you've taught me through your work, this one maybe stands at the top, which is the idea of risk inversion. And risk inversion is this observation, which is that the riskiest things are usually the ones that you don't measure. Which is incredible.
The measurement inversion, right?
Measurement inversion, yes.
Yeah, the measurement inversion. I was expanding on decision analysis, which came from Ron Howard at Stanford. And that was an offshoot of decision theory, game theory sorts of stuff. So the whole idea of computing the value of information before you make decisions. They were applying it in pretty straightforward in the academic examples they were using. It was pretty straightforward, simple decision tree stuff. But in real world decisions, people are making cost benefit analysis models in a spreadsheet where there's a big number of costs and benefits and a big cash flow over time. And there's a large number of uncertain variables that are continuous values. So you have to describe your uncertainty as your actuarial listeners will know. You describe their uncertainty with a probability distribution over the possible values of a particular quantity. And how you compute information values on something like that is a little bit more complicated. So we started systematically applying that. So we took decision analysis, we combined it with the idea that a lot of things that people say are measurable really are, if you think about it from a Bayesian statistics point of view and think about measurement as a quantitatively expressed reduction in uncertainty, not necessarily elimination. And a lot of research on decision psychology, which methods actually measurably outperform others and so forth. We put all this together and we started applying these decision analysis methods of large decision models with lots of cost benefit variables over a long period of time, lots of uncertainties. And we started systematically computing information values on each individual variable. And just for your listeners who might not be familiar with it, the value of information comes down to making a better bet. If you had less uncertainty, you're more likely to make a better bet. There's a way to compute the economic value of that. Well, when we did this for a large number of these decision models, and these decision models would be cost benefit analysis for some initiative, software, public policy or something that might have a couple of dozen or maybe a couple of hundred variables. And we would compute the value of information for each individual variable. And what we found out is that the high information value variables are often not what the client would have measured otherwise. They would have measured something differently. And in fact, if you look at their past behavior, you tend to find out that the things that they spend the most time measuring are the things that actually are statistically less likely to improve a decision.
Yeah, they don't matter.
That have the highest information value on average were often things that were just completely ignored. They're not even in the business case, much less measured. So
amazing. I mean, I think it's worth just dwelling on this for a second longer, because I listened to a few podcasts of yours that you've done, and this is big, deep, important stuff. You measure the things that are easy to measure, that are just laying around in front of you, because you can measure just by not lifting a finger, but they're not the things that matter. And I want to make another kind of really important point here about your work, which is that your assertions and your conclusions, these aren't things that you're pulling out of the air. I mean, it's a thread that is just throughout everything I've read of yours, which is that it is all grounded in research and empirical analysis. So when you say the value of information, what you mean is you mean that we have computed the risk without the information, and then the risk with the information, and we've calculated the difference in value between these two scenarios, and that is the value of information. Very profound.
Yeah, well, thank you. And actually, that's an important point to talk about the precision of the language here, because there's a lot of fluffy stuff out there. I was just having a discussion on LinkedIn, actually, about the COSO framework. You'd mentioned that, a lot of your listeners are actuaries. Yep. But they might not be familiar with some of these ERM frameworks out there. There's these kind of soft management consulting, kind of auditor-driven frameworks, and they come up with standards. They look structured and formal, but they tend to resort to qualitative methods, like a very simple risk matrix. And if some of your listeners aren't familiar with that, you can just Google that and see a picture of risk matrix, and it's got red, yellow, green squares on it and so forth. And this apparently constitutes risk analysis for about half of organizations that are practicing ERM. We've actually done surveys in cybersecurity risk, project risk, and enterprise risk management. And the slight majority in all of those is somebody using this qualitative risk matrix. Only about 20% are using quantitative methods for risk analysis. And I remember years ago telling actuaries that in some cases, I was interviewing actuaries for certain parts of the couple of first books. And I would tell them about these methods, and they were surprised to hear about them. They did not know about them. And they were surprised that anybody would ever do any risk analysis that way. I said, no, I'm not kidding. This is actually what they do. And they make these big decisions based on this. These aren't trivial decisions. These are big corporate strategic decisions. In fact, I think the main reason that these qualitative methods might not do more damage than they could is I think people intuitively and probably correctly override these results.
They ignore it.
Often or they game it in such a way that it kind of matches their intuition anyway. So it probably ends up being in the category of what I would call merely useless.
Yes.
Other researchers, I cite Tony Cox's work there, where he did a lot of really a quantitative analysis of risk matrices. And he concluded that many of them can be worse than useless. Which means not just a waste of time, but they actually added error to the expert intuition. They diluted the expert knowledge. They added ambiguity to the process. So they actually made things worse. They create things that other researchers had called the illusion of communication. You and I both agree that a risk is medium. We feel like we've accomplished something because we agreed on it. But it turns out we do completely different things by that. And so there's a couple of researchers I cite on that particular front.
So you actually deliver a pretty interesting critique of ordinal statistics, right? And there's a variety. Typically, I think a lot of these risk matrices, they tend to sort of have this, scale of 1 to 5, or you say low, medium, high, that kind of thing, right? But these ordinal statistics are actually pretty horrific, and it's not numerical analysis, it's not quantitative analysis, right? It's something entirely different. It has its own
kind of a pseudo math. It feels like math to people. And here's a really important thing. This is a really important question for actuaries and all quantitative analysts or analysts of any kind to ask. How do we know it works? Even the mathematical methods, how do we know it works? Well, the thing I was going to point out before was there's actually been some really large clinical trials, some of them with more data than the COVID vaccine test. Philip Tetlock did the 20-year-long Good Judgment Project. He tracked 284 experts, 82,000 individual forecasts he tracked. And he concluded that he couldn't find any domain in which humans clearly outperformed crude extrapolation algorithms, naive statistical algorithms, but based on historical data and so forth, not these ordinal scales. And so I spent a lot of time citing a lot of research about these ordinal scales and so forth. And the problem with risk analysis and risk management in general is it's not an area where analysts and decision makers can get immediate, unambiguous feedback. So if you said I did something that reduced the risk of, let's say, a cybersecurity data breach from 10% annually to 5% annually, how many years would you have to wait to observe that that was the case? And did you even know that the 10% was correct in the first place? You're not going to get immediate feedback, and it won't be unambiguous. It'll be highly delayed feedback, assuming you're tracking it at all. Most people aren't even tracking it. In that kind of environment, experience does not turn into learning. Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein actually did some research on this, and they found out they agreed on this one thing. They kind of came from different areas. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, developed behavioral economics, was the basis for behavioral economics from what he called prospect theory and so forth. In these areas, one of the things they agreed on is you had to have consistent, immediate, unambiguous feedback for experience to turn into learning. And we just don't have that in risk analysis. So here's the issue. How can we know what works? Well, we can't rely on our impressions of what works, because there's another set of research that uses the term algorithm aversion. And there's also a set of research that I've dubbed analysis placebos. These aren't the terms that the authors used, that second set, the analysis placebo. I just grouped them together on that because they're all saying the same thing. The problem with analysis placebos is that you can easily adopt a method that seems structured and formal, and your confidence will inevitably go up, even if the method improves nothing or even makes things worse for your estimates and decisions. It's almost inevitable that your confidence will improve if you're working on something that doesn't give immediate feedback, but it seems structured and formal. It seems like it should work, right? And you just feel better about your estimates and decisions. So I cite multiple studies that come to the same conclusion from completely different areas. And then I said, these are all kind of saying the same thing. I'm going to call these analysis placebos. We can't count on our impression, our perception of effectiveness of a methodology that has highly delayed, inconsistent, ambiguous feedback. That's why when you do vaccine trials and clinical drug trials, you have to have control groups. Yep. You can't just assume that, well, if people are feeling better, they must actually be getting better, right? Or because the doctors think the drug should work, that it will work, right? That's not how we test drugs or vaccines, and we shouldn't test our risk analysis methods that way. And
why we have science. I mean,
that's why we have science. And another really important thing is that when it comes to perception, apparently algorithms are swimming upstream a little bit. And that's because of this effect called algorithm aversion. There is a tendency to grade algorithms more harshly for errors than they would humans.
Yes.
So even if decision makers, they've tested this in clinical trials as well in experiments, even if you give people who are trying to estimate things the actual records of past errors of algorithms to forecast something versus, say, human experts or their own estimates, if the algorithms make almost any errors at all, they'll tend to default to the human. Yep. Whereas the people starting with the human, they'll accept much bigger errors from the human before they ever consider switching over to the less erroneous algorithm. So it appears that the decision model they're using is this method has to be nearly perfect. If it's not, I default to a clearly more imperfect method. And that's a problem. So how do we go about measuring the effectiveness of risk analysis methods with this feedback problem? Well, there are methods. One is we can do what we call component testing. All right. So software engineers and engineers in general are familiar with this concept. Lots of the components of risk analysis methods have been studied thoroughly. Like, for example, all the research on ordinal scales. We know something about the behavior people have with ordinal scales. We know something about the behavior people have with putting two ordinal scales on a matrix and putting dots on it. We've measured something about the ambiguity of the terminology and the unintended consequences of arbitrary features of the scale, right? Arbitrary features of the method actually have a huge impact on how people use them in a way that the designers of the method really didn't anticipate.
What would be an example of that? Can you elaborate on that a second? What would be an example of a design that would influence behavior?
Oh, sure. So you would think, for example, that if I had a 5-point scale and I decided to go from a 5-point scale to a 7 or 10-point scale, that I could kind of extrapolate people's distributions. Imagine I'd measured a little distribution of how often people chose a 1 on a scale or a 2 on a scale. So I've got this distribution on this scale, and I extrapolate that to a 10-point scale. I decide to go to a 10-point scale. You would think that you could kind of extrapolate that.
The shape of the distribution would be the same.
No, it turns out no, that's not the case. There's this one really weird effect called partition dependence. This guy, Craig Fox, was studying this. Suppose I went at a 5-point scale where they're measuring impact, right? Okay. So they measure impact sometimes in dollar values, let's say, and a 1 means less than $1 million impact. Maybe that's what a 1 means. And then you've got this 5-point scale, and you've defined 2 to mean greater than $1 million, but less than 5 million or something like that, up to 5. All right. Maybe 5 means 20 million plus or something. Well, suppose you went from that to a 10-point scale. And of course, you have finer and more buckets, but maybe the first one is exactly the same. It's defined exactly the same as the one on the 5-point scale. So both of these ones are defined as less than $1 million impact. Why do people choose one less frequently on the 10-point scale than they do the 5-point scale? You defined it exactly the same. Well, we have this subjective algorithm to want to spread out our answers, right? So it turns out that people don't really pay that much attention to the definitions that the designers laboriously tried to come up with, right? They came up with all these detailed definitions of what a 1 means and what a 2 means, et cetera. And they may be influenced by that, but they appear to be influenced just as much by their subjective tendency to spread their answers out.
That's incredible. I'd like to just sort of pull out 2 points, 2 kind of themes here that have been introduced. And we're going to keep going on these themes. So I just want to make sure that we talk about them. So on the one hand, you have this observation that the decision-making process that organizations go through or people go through do not appear to actually work, right? In the sense that they don't drive better decisions. And the other one, you have the design of any particular system will introduce biases, right? Which can cause the system to fail. But on the first one, I just want to kind of run an idea past you, which is that back to the kind of the original question, which is it feels to me like in a lot of cases the thing that organizations want is actually consensus building. They don't necessarily want a decision that makes sense, right? So they want everybody on the same page. And in that sense, these kind of a random analytical framework, which gives us confidence that we're being, scientism, right? So we're like, looks like we're doing science. And so we all feel good about that. And therefore we feel good about developing a consensus to take a particular action. Like I think of the difference between kind of like an executive in a company and a more junior person in a company. The executive spends all their time building consensus, right? Around taking actions in the organization. And so that's actually the hard thing to do in that model of an organization. And anything that helps build consensus is a beneficial tool for an organization. That doesn't mean they're making good decisions. That's the amazing thing to me, right? It can be random.
I'll go even a little bit further because consensus is part of another objective. I think a broader objective might be just anxiety reduction.
Okay.
So whether they have to build consensus with a team or whether they're really just making a decision for themselves, what they want is less anxiety about the decision.
Right.
I think that's another way to look at it. And that includes the consensus building objective.
Yes. Yes.
To that, I would say, well, if that really is your objective, I wouldn't refute that. I wouldn't argue that. There are plenty of ways. If you want to build consensus or reduce anxiety at any cost, then sure, lots of these methods could work. I think some people, though, at least sometimes, actually do care about making better bets, better decisions on uncertainty, especially when they include the allocation of large resources and in many cases, even public health and safety, right? The returns on investments for, investors in a large corporation or the satisfaction of your customers. These things matter. If that's what you care about, and I'm not going to try to say they should have a different objective. I would say, look, if your objective really is just anxiety reduction, I guess that's the way to go. But I think, and I hope a lot of my customers are actually trying to improve their decisions. They actually do have a dilemma. They're not sure what to do. They want to try to reduce the chance of big opportunity losses by either rejecting what would have been a good investment or accepting a bad one, right? They actually do want to reduce their risk on those sorts of fronts. When that's the case, well, then all the evidence says you really ought to be using more quantitative methods. And there's plenty of evidence, even more so than the evidence against the qualitative methods. There's plenty of evidence for quantitative methods. Paul Meehl, a researcher who had been comparing human experts to statistical models since the 1950s, all the way up until he died in the early 2000s here, He'd collected over 150 studies. He said he could only find 6 cases where the humans did slightly better or just as well as the algorithms.
That's incredible.
The rest of them were pretty clear for the algorithms.
And that kind of, so I'm gonna try and tell a more sympathetic story, if I can, and see what you think about this. So in a certain model of an organization's decision-making process, if you have enough diversity within the decision-making group, right, you're going to have enough expertise that's going to, if you can get consensus among a diverse enough group, then you probably have considered a lot of things that no individual can think of on their own. Right. And there's one other theme about your work, which I find interesting. We're going to come into the AIE framework in a sec, which is going to really pull this point out, which is that, real expertise is a very important source of information. Right. If you don't know what to do, the first thing you should do is check the research or ask somebody who really knows what they're talking about, and they will be able to help you. Right. And if you can integrate a lot of different sources of expertise, and I think large organizations have a lot of different sources of expertise, then you could argue that they're actually not doing too bad of a job. They're kind of they're sort of falling backwards into a methodology that is not explicit, but implicitly doing the things that you would agree with, even though they're sort of not, nobody's necessarily conscious that that's what's happening. What they do every day is these executives is they spend their time trying to create consensus, and the process by which consensus is created is actually getting diverse views into the pot to consider things properly. But it's very messy, right? And I think that's kind of the problem, that you're not actually being explicit about what you're considering. You're just sort of making it, you just sort of, and you can corrupt that process through like a charismatic leader or whatever, can just sort of railroad something through, like it's just unscientific.
Sure.
What do you think about that?
And that kind of gets back to that illusion of communication I talked about.
Yes,
before.
right, exactly, yes.
It may only appear that there's consensus. So 2 researchers, Nick Hoyer and Dave Budescu, looked into this quite a lot. And this is where they found that even the verbal labels that people use for things like likelihood and impact and risk, where they say this is unlikely or medium versus moderate versus this is critical or extremely unlikely or something like this, those arbitrary choices of the words you use actually also have an impact on people's distribution of responses. And it also leads to that illusion of communication thing again, which is you and I both agree that something's unlikely or medium risk or something, and we think we agree. And in fact, we don't. Yes, those are all good points. I would say this, when it comes to methods for aggregating multiple experts, that's a testable hypothesis.
Yes.
The good news is there are methods that have been tested. After I just got done talking about the relative performance of algorithms over subject matter experts, I will also say there are ways to use subject matter experts that measurably outperform other ways of using them. So in the AIE method, we don't reject the use of experts. What we say is just do less of the math in your head. Right. Make the math explicit, okay? Make sure you define your terms well, get the math out of your head. And where you do need to rely on human experts, there are ways to use the human experts that measurably outperform others. We know that experts, for example, are systemically overconfident when they estimate things. And you can adjust for this. Sometimes researchers call this debiasing. You can adjust for this overconfidence bias through training. We've actually calibrated, it's called calibrated probability assessment training. We've calibrated over 1,600 people in the last 22 years. So we have a lot of data on this.
What is calibration? Tell us what you do when you do that. This is an amazing idea.
Yeah, calibration is just the idea that if you give people practice, they can get pretty good at putting subjective probabilities on things.
Yep.
It's a skill you can learn, right? Just like you might not normally need to estimate distances in kilometers to things out in the open, right? In the open country, right? That's 1 kilometer, that's 2.5 kilometers. But with a little bit of practice, you wouldn't be bad at it. And the same turns out to be true with probabilities, right? So what we do is we give people a series of exercises where they assign probabilities to various statements. And these are, at first, they're trivia questions. They can be generic trivia questions or specific to their field of expertise. But we might ask questions like, would a hockey puck fit in a golf hole? True or false? And they'd say true. And then I'd say, how confident are you? Are you 50% confident, like it's a coin flip, you really had no idea, you just picked one randomly? Or you're 100% certain, you'd say 100%. Maybe you're 80 or 90% confident, et cetera. And they would say how confident they were. We do this with a number of questions over and over again. We'd also ask them questions for a 90% confidence interval. Not to be confused with the term confidence interval that comes up in statistics a lot. This is more like a fiducial interval or credible interval, but you come up with a range that you're 90% sure contains the answer. And we might ask you, when was Napoleon Bonaparte born? What year? And you'd give a range, right? We do this over and over again. We give an initial benchmark test. We find out that people find out that their ranges initially are far too narrow. They don't nearly represent their real uncertainty.
Consistent with Kahneman's work on prospect theory, right? Where we underestimate tail events, right?
Yeah, well, it's a related concept. Prospect theory had to do with his empirical analysis of expected utility theory that Oscar Morgenstern and John von Neumann came up with in Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And a bunch of other people had done some work on that kind of stuff. But he was just doing an empirical analysis of how people actually make risk-reward trade-offs, as opposed to what the theory says a rational person should do.
And so, I wanted to make that point because you're about to tell us that it's not actually so universal, aren't you? This problem, because you can fix it.
No, it's which problem again? The
problem of calibrating confidence intervals, right? So you come up with a confidence interval, and so when I walk around my life, right, I read Kahneman, I read whatever book relies on that work, and I think, oh, people just can't do this. Right? This is a fact of human psychology. We cannot estimate confidence intervals or tail events very properly. We're just bad at this kind of thing. But you taught me something different, Doug.
Oh, yeah. Well, our research shows that after about a half day of training with these exercises, and then also teaching them a few techniques, not just repetition, but a few other techniques, that about 85% of people who go through the training are statistically indistinguishable from a bookie at the end of the day.
Amazing.
And bookies are pretty good.
Yeah.
They're pretty good at putting odds on things. When you look at all the times they said something was 80% likely, it happened about 80% of the time.
Yeah.
And all the times they said it was 95% likely, it happened about 95% of the time. This is what being well calibrated means. And of all the times they stated a 90% confidence interval for some unknown quantity, like the duration of a project or what their sales will be next quarter, or when Napoleon Bonaparte was born or something, they find out that after training, they can get very close to ranges where about 90% of the data points fall within their stated ranges. They just get better at it. They don't get better at trivia. They get better at quantifying their current state of uncertainty. They just get a better feel for what 80% feels like, what 90% feels like, et cetera. Now, here's what's really interesting, though. If you have multiple subject matter experts, you talk about getting multiple experts together to agree on things. One of the most common methods for getting the estimate out of a group of experts is to get them in the room and they build consensus and they all come up with a number. Research shows that this may actually be one of the worst methods for coming up with estimates, because, I mean, obviously the most overconfident people will have end up having a bigger say in things.
Conversation. Yes.
But there are methods for aggregating experts that measurably outperform other methods. So if you have a SME, a subject matter expert, that's the term that gets used a lot. I don't know how common that is among your listeners.
I've not heard that before. Great.
Me? Subject matter expert?
Yeah.
Well, there's algorithms that actually have been studied quite a lot. There's a lot of methods that have been studied over the decades for how you should combine the probability estimates of multiple experts, multiple SMEs. And we've been testing all of these models, and there's been some previous, meta study on this, comparing different models, and we actually have a lot of data because as I said, we've calibrated over 1,600 people, and each of those 1,600 people answered typically a couple of hundred questions by the time that they're done with their training. So we have many tens of thousands of data points on all of these things, well over 100,000 total. But we took 434 of the more recent versions of the test. And of those, that group answered 52,000 questions total, 20,000 true false questions, and 32,000 range questions. And we've been doing this analysis, and we're finding out that definitely some methods of aggregation measurably outperform others. We call this the Franken-SME. I don't know if I'm going to stick with that term. I don't know if I'm going to keep that term or not. But this is really interesting. If you have two calibrated people that each say independently of each other without communicating, if two calibrated people each say that something's 80% likely, what percentage of those instances would turn out to be true?
Okay.
More than 80%.
Right.
And that's consistent with Bayesian methods.
Yep.
So that's actually consistent. If you can work that out in Bayesian methods, you can think about how you would treat various conditions using Bayes factors, right? Yep. And we have this model where we say, what would the Bayesian aggregation of these different conditional probabilities be? How would I add up these conditions that this one expert said this and this other expert said this? How do I add those up? And we've made this scatter plot on it. And the scatter plot, it actually had an R squared of 0.98.
Holy jeez.
And so you look at this thing and you're going, you're saying, well, you know, here's the theory and here's what we actually observe in our 52,000 data points. And it's pretty close.
So you're telling me that Bayes theorem, and you know, you have a very interesting discussion of Bayes theorem, and I went down a bit of a rabbit hole when I was reading your stuff. I don't know if we can, I don't know, we'll see if we can get into it more deeply here, but but you're telling me here right now, I think, that Bayes theorem actually describes to a R squared of 0.98 a feature of human decision making. That when you aggregate experts,
it describes how you should treat how to aggregate the opinions of multiple experts.
Yeah.
And these would, by the way, these would be random pairs of experts answering the same question. These are experts that don't even know each other. They weren't calibrated at the same time. One could have been calibrated in 2015 and the other in 2018 or something like this. And they both answered the Napoleon Bonaparte question or the hockey puck question or something like this. And one said, I'm 80% sure that the hockey puck will fit in the golf hole. And the other said, I'm 70% sure. You don't average those. With a Bayes factor, it ends up being slightly more than 80%. Yep. So there are ways of aggregating experts. And this is something that not only is based well in theory, but has a lot of empirical data, and not just the data I'm doing. This has been studied to death for quite a while. We do have a lot of data compared to a lot of academics, though. So in many ways, we're sort of reinforcing what they've previously seen with their smaller data sets. We didn't have to invent any of this, really. We're just saying, hey, we've done all this business now. We're sharing this data with people. So it's completely consistent with Bayes' theorem. It's verified empirically. And so I think it behooves people to think in terms of, if some subjective methods measurably outperform other subjective methods, and I feel like I have to have some subjective input in my model, well, then at least I want to use the better subjective methods, right? Yep. That's a starting point. And then on top of that, let's just do less of the math in our heads. Let's make the math more explicit. And if we can do that, we can get really good at quantifying our current state of uncertainty about a problem. And that allows us to compute the value of information. That was circling back to the information value sort of thing. If you can compute the value of information on all these individual variables, then you can measure what really matters most. And then you don't have to rely so much on the subject matter expertise. You can conduct empirical measurements. You can do Bayesian updates on your prior states of uncertainty, right?
I really want to tie this into your framework more deeply, because we kind of started in the middle step, which is use experts and calibrate experts, right? So let's say you get a particular question. I mean, you almost have this really cool party trick, Doug, where I've seen you do it a few times, and I've read about doing it, where somebody will hand you something that's unmeasurable, and you say, okay, well, let's get to work on this, right? So let's pick one here. So how about the value of innovation, right?
Value of innovation. Well, I did start doing a webinar called How to Measure Anything in Innovation. So I have some ideas on that particular one. So the first thing we have to ask, the first two things we need to ask are, what do you see when you see more of it?
Right.
So when you see more innovation, what are you actually seeing? And just as importantly, why do you care? The why do you care question helps you frame the problem a little bit better. It helps us figure out what we think we're actually measuring. So why do people want to measure innovation?
Oh, because it increases economic growth. It makes profits, right? When you're able to do things. But
let's think of it in terms of decisions it's meant to support. Those are all good things, right? But if I want to measure something, presumably, and usually in the context that we're talking about, it's because I'm trying to improve some decision. So what decision am I trying to improve by measuring innovation? I have a few ideas. I don't know if you.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can go too, but I'll try. When I want to innovate, reason why I want innovation, so let's say as a corporate executive, is because I want our company to make more profits. I want to build better products. So I want some source of work for people that's valuable for the company. That's what I think of when I think of this.
Well, let's frame this in terms of a decision then. So the decision might be, which of my teams are more innovative?
Great, sure.
Maybe that's the question, because based on my measure of their innovation, I might assign different teams to different R&D problems. Okay.
Yes. So I actually just interrupt you again and just say, I love it. So this is wonderful because, another very profound idea, it's one of these things that's easy to say, but hard to do, is that, decisions is the mechanism through which actually you have to think, right? So it's like, what decision are you going to make when you have this information? That's such a critical piece. And here I've read your books and I've listened to it, but I haven't. And you asked me the question, and I still screwed it up though. But please keep going.
It takes practice, Yes. It's not intuitive, really. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science, but it's not an habit. It's not a habit that people have ingrained right away. Yeah. So you think in terms of the decision. Okay, so the decision is, should I spend more on, people that measure really well on innovation because I want to beef up my teams? That's the dilemma I have. Okay. So innovation is a good thing. We all accept whatever it is. We got to define it still, but whatever innovation is, we accept it's a good thing. And so the dilemma might be, should I expend more resources on this? All right. There's plenty of other decisions you might be able to support. Sometimes people are trying to measure an innovation index for a country. Why do you care about that? Well, should I base my R&D there? Can I hire better people in that kind of country? Can I set up there or something? Or am I using my innovation index of a country? There are indices for this. They're not very good, by the way. But can I use this to forecast something about a country that I can use to inform other decisions, right? That would be the other thing that I could do. So let's switch gears over to what do I see when I see more of it? This is the definition problem. This is what does innovation even mean? Well, before I give you my thoughts, do you have any ideas on what you see when you see more innovation? What are some observable examples?
So I see solutions to problems that I didn't expect, right? When I see innovation, I think it's creativity, which is another kind of ambiguous term. But I think I handed somebody something, I know they're working on something that's hard that I don't understand, and they come up with a solution that I wasn't expecting. So I'm surprised about what they've done.
Sure, right. So that might imply that what you're doing is, let's say you're keeping track of expectations of initially, and then tracking, preferably adjusted, with some control for bias. Right? Mm-hmm. Like you say, here's what I expect to occur, and somebody other than yourself, or maybe you do it as a blind where you don't even know who the tests are, the teams are. And you say, okay, in this particular case, I didn't expect the outcome. And there's a few other things though. I don't think that's enough. I don't think that, a Madison Avenue claim is, look, if it doesn't sell, it's not creative. That's another way to think about it. We can each make up lots of stuff that's unexpected. We can come up with random stories about things that are unexpected, right? Yeah. There's some people that are great at BS and they can just do this all day. Is that innovation? Well, innovation should have other observable outcomes. Like, for example, if landing a rocket on its tail using propulsive recovery, if that's innovative, it should at least work. Well, it does, actually. I mean, maybe my kids when they were 5 could have invented the same thing, but their ideas wouldn't have worked, right? Yeah, so that's one thing. It should work. But also when we say something's innovative, there's a couple of other things that we're thinking of. It tends to imply that we're leading adopters or leading developers as opposed to trailing, right? And it's effective. There's a big benefit in some way. It works and it's effective in some way. There's a lot of value to it in the end. So I may be the leading adopter of something that's of no value at all. Is that innovation? Maybe not. I may adopt something that's extremely useful, but I'm not the leading adopter. Was that innovation? Maybe I'm the last hospital to pick up electronic medical records.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm sure they get a lot of benefit out of it, but I wouldn't call that innovation. Okay. So generally, the term innovation, I think people can debate the definitions here, but I think it generally implies that you're on the early end of something that works, that has value to it. You're the early adopter. You're the early developer. Okay. And you don't even have to be the first one. Can we say that customers are innovative by the way that they adopt things? Like there's some leading customers. There's customers who are leading adopters of new services and technologies. Well, actually, there's a mathematical model called the Bass technology diffusion model. It's a technology diffusion model, and it has these two shape coefficients in it. It produces a sigmoid curve that kind of tries to model empirically what the adoption rate of a technology in a population is. And it's got these two coefficients. It's got the imitator coefficient and the innovator coefficient. And these two parameters are just two fitting parameters for a curve. The idea being that if you have a lot of innovators, they tend to adopt things regardless of who else has adopted them or not.
Yep.
If everybody in the population was just an innovator, the growth would be sort of linear looking. People would just randomly adopt things regardless of whether or not other people were adopting them. But if there were some imitators, it would tend to follow this curve that would have an inflection point in it. They would resist adoption at first, and then after you got past some threshold, then it really accelerates because now more people are imitating. There's been a lot of technologies that have been fit to that kind of model. So it's just a two-parameter shape curve. But that's one use of the term. So one thing we might ask when we're asking about defining innovation is whose innovation? A country's, potential employees? Maybe I'm asking whether or not a product is innovative. And maybe what people mean by that is, should this be the product I invest in developing versus this other product, right? I've heard people use the term innovative that way, in which case, okay, let's figure out what we mean when we say these things. I ask people, have you seen situations where there's more innovation than other times where there's less innovation? They go, yeah. Well, what did you see that was different? Define it in terms of its observable consequences, because once you've done that, the rest is trivial math. You're halfway there, okay? You just have to figure out what's my empirical data collection method and how do I do the analysis mathematically, right? So if you're asking the question, I get surprised a lot by their answers. I think that's part of it. Okay, I think it also has to be a valuable answer, right? I think whatever area you're in, I think I could probably come up with answers that would surprise you and would be completely useless. So I don't think that's what you meant by innovation, right? Yeah. But assuming that they made money and you wouldn't have thought of it otherwise, that's the other part of innovation, I think, is that there's an indication that we wouldn't have thought of it otherwise, that this would be a rare idea that works. Yeah. It's rare because we're the early adopters, we're the early developers of it, and it turns out to be very valuable. So if we think of that in terms of which R&D project should I invest in, for example, maybe that's what I meant by innovation, is the product innovative. Okay, well, what am I really doing then? Am I forecasting future sales? Am I forecasting something about adoption rate among a population? And which features of products correlate with that? When somebody looks at a product and says, I think this product is more innovative than that product, what do they see when they see more of it? Generally, when they come up with examples, they're defining things that they can observe, and they're using that to make forecasts of other observable things. So you've got some input variables that are observations, you have some output variables that you're trying to forecast. And regardless of what model you come up with, you will probably have, for most big organizations, you have enough opportunity to test that model over and over again to keep testing the model. By the way, I'm all about testing models. I think you should be skeptical of models, applied information economics, or anything else. Be skeptical of models. That just means test them. You test models and you adopt things that work. Of course, there's a lot of existing research to build on, though. You don't have to start brand new from a blank sheet of paper in terms of what actually works. We can build on research that's already been done. It's been measured before. That's kind of a key concept here, including innovation. When I started putting together the How to Measure Anything in Innovation webinar, I started doing my research just like I would on any other project. And there's all this really interesting research on, does diversity in R&D teams matter? Is there a relationship between the chance that someone's an inventor and their visual spatial IQ? It's actually a pretty important one. It's a big visual, not other categories of IQ like verbal IQ or something, but visual spatial IQ in particular turns out to be a pretty good predictor of whether or not someone has a patent. I think that's interesting. All of those things are interesting. And here's another thing that I did as a result of preparing for that webinar. I looked at the Global Innovation Index, which looks at the indices of the innovation of various countries. And I look at the corporate innovation indices that various consulting firms come up with, McKinsey and PwC, and also Forbes has an innovation list. What I find interesting is the latter group are completely uncorrelated with each other.
Really?
If they're measuring something real and they're measuring something where more than one of them is, correct, then I should be able to find two that are correlated with each other, and there aren't any. What they do tend to correlate with is both on the country side and the corporate side is last year's profit or GDP. Turns out to be a poor predictor of next year's profit or GDP.
Yeah.
So apparently what they're calling innovation is this equation which uses things like a country's GDP or a corporation's growth and profit over an 8-quarter period, or however they're defining it. They're using that in their innovation index formula, but that formula is a poor predictor of anything else. So whatever they're measuring, they're either not measuring the same thing, or none of them are measuring innovation, right? So I'm skeptical of all those indices. I think what people need to do is think in terms of what is it that you're actually forecasting and for what purpose, and what observations are you making that would support that forecast? You see, people are making these decisions, these estimates intuitively anyway. They're already saying, I use my best judgment. Great. When you use your judgment, what information is your judgment based on? What experiences is your judgment based on? Because there are no experiences that I can't begin to model as some sort of a historical relationship.
Yes.
Right. So, if you have experience, you have a data, right? Yes. That's all of our experience is historical data, except with selective recall and flawed inferences. That's what our experience really is. So let's take that experience and quit doing so much of the math in our heads. Let's be more explicit about that. And we can still update our experiences with empirical data, right? We don't have to reject the use of subject matter experts. There's plenty of room for use of subject matter experts in applied information economics. We start with that, actually. We rely on subject matter experts to do things like define the problem. There's no algorithm for that. I still have to go to the client and say, what's the problem here? What can you help me understand the thing you're trying to measure? Can you help me understand the decision? Subject matter experts are really important for that. They're really important for identifying and quantifying their current state of uncertainty. They always have a current state of uncertainty. That's why you calibrate people. But then after that, you run that value of information calculation and then empirically measure everything else to update their state of uncertainty and make a better bet.
So I think you've kind of you quite effectively walk through I think of it as the first half, I guess, of your, when approaching a problem and modeling it, there are 4 assumptions we have to make, right? So one of them is it's been measured before. Another one is you have more data than you think, right? Even if it's inside your head or if it's lying around, you just haven't noticed it. And the next 2 are you need less data than you think. And there's an important idea there, which you could touch on. And then useful data is actually pretty easy to find. So around like collecting data, the phenomenal idea of when you don't know anything about something, even just a little bit of information is incredibly enlightening, right?
Yeah, that's actually true. And this is another thing that's a surprising result for some people for Bayesian analysis methods. You might have run into situations where people assume that because they have a lot of uncertainty, they therefore need a lot of data to measure it because they have so much uncertainty. But mathematically speaking, just the opposite is true. The more uncertainty you have, the bigger uncertainty reduction you get from the first few observations. the way to think of it is if you know almost nothing, almost anything will tell you something.
Mm-hmm.
That's more like what the math actually says. So it's in those very cases where we have lots of uncertainty that a little bit of data greatly reduces it. And guess which variables have the highest information value typically? The very variables that have the highest value to being measured are also, for that reason, easier to measure.
Right.
Because they're so uncertain, which is extremely convenient. That the things I really need to measure are actually easier to measure. You mentioned something before that people choose what's easy to measure. I'm not really sure that's always true. I think they just measure what they know how to measure, even if the thing they're measuring is very challenging, like software costs. Software development cost is a notoriously uncertain and difficult measurement problem. Of course, you can measure it just like everything else, but it's hard to measure compared to other things. I think in many cases, benefits of software are actually easier to measure. They're just unfamiliar with the simple methods to do that. Or they're assuming that because they have lots of uncertainty about a productivity improvement or a future sales increase from updating our customer relationship management system or something like this, they're assuming that because it's so uncertain, they need a lot of data. And in fact, that's not true at all. It's easier to measure because it's uncertain, not in spite of being uncertain.
I want to talk. I mean, we're kind of running low on time, and man, there's just so much. There's just so much to cover. So, but one issue I really want to make sure that we discuss today is something that isn't discussed quite explicitly in your books, but I'm fascinated by as a subject of enormous uncertainty, and this is in the world of innovation again for startups, business strategy, right? So here's like the problem, right? Which is I want to succeed with a company, or I want to start a company. Right. And oftentimes you have this problem of nobody's done it before, or you want to launch a new product line, let's say. All these things are sources of innovation. But it's a creative kind of task, but one where usually you'll have kind of one or two big ideas that you would choose to invest in or not, and you want to rally people around it. And I think that, they say that the most successful founders, which I think that this makes sense to me, are those who kind of are their own customers, who know what the problem is, and so they can, they don't need as much education on it. But have you done much thought or spent much time thinking about business strategy setting, in the more general sense? Enormously uncertain. The frameworks that are available probably fall prey to a lot of the criticisms that we discussed much earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I look at, say, for example, all of these enterprise risk management or risk management standards out there, or really the standards organizations for most things like ISO, NIST, and National Institute for Standards and Technology, the COSO standards, each of these. I think they get a lot of fluff in them.
Yeah.
Very fluffy. It's kind of hard to tell what they're really saying. And they make all of these assertions with no empirical data behind it. Strategic information falls into three categories, and they come up with three things that sound like kind of, word salad. And they have no data or even theory, even mathematical theory behind anything that they're saying. I think people should just be a lot more skeptical about all of those methods and really hold them to task, because they're affecting things. There's a law, Dodd-Frank, that particular set of regulations was talking about the risk management requirements for the corporation. They were referring to the FDIC, the corporation is what they refer to in the law. And they say right in the law, the corporation shall use a risk matrix to evaluate risk. It's a statement. It's a demand that they actually do that. And that's based on what? Is it based on the idea that this is going to help them more realistically assess and then reduce risk? I tell people all the time, your biggest risk, regardless of your industry, is a flawed risk assessment method. If your risk assessment is flawed, you're going to try to conduct risk management, which is directed in the wrong way. Right? If you ask somebody, what are your three biggest risks, and the risk assessment method itself is flawed, they don't know what their three biggest risks are. Right? If it's all this high, medium, low, red, yellow, green stuff, dots on a risk matrix. Can I spend $2 million to move this dot from here to here? None of that is actually based on any kind of fundamental theory or math or empirical data of improving things. That's what we really have to be skeptical about.
Why are they even there? Do you know? Like, where does this stuff come from? Like, why do people like it?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head very early on. You know, what are the objectives of people? If people feel satisfied by the appearance of structure, then they are going to be willing to adopt these things. And I tell people all the time, astrology is structured. It is. Astrology is structured and formal. Does it work? No. It has no practical working value at all. But if you want to feel better by knowing your astrological sign and what you want to do that day, well, maybe it meets that objective. If you're going to feel better regardless, maybe it meets that objective. Okay. But if you actually want to make better decisions in life, I don't think your horoscope is the way to go. Yeah. I think there's other ways to do that. When my wife and I bought our house, or certainly when we started our business and things like this, we ran a big decision model on a Monte Carlo simulation. We did all sorts of analysis on this sort of stuff, and we forecasted outcomes, and we made big decisions about how to start things and how to actually progress throughout the years using that method. And of course, now I'm doing much more analysis on what my last few years are going to look like before I retire. And we're making big decisions based on this stuff because I've spent too much time in the research. I really don't trust intuition as much as I used to, or at least unaided intuition. There's lots of intuition you can use, by the way. So we're not rejecting the use of intuition or subject matter expertise, but you want to be skeptical of your own judgment. That's really important. And be skeptical of the methods that other people are putting together. Why do they think that works? How do we know this works? That's the question everyone ought to be asking all the time. Even in very quantitative areas of physics, you know, there's great theoretical foundations for some things, and they still know to ask, how do we know this works, right? They still need to build a giant particle accelerator to demonstrate the Higgs boson exists, right? So they're constantly testing these things, but for some reason, we're not doing that enough in management consulting or executive decisions or standards or organizations. That just isn't coming up enough. I think it's too easy to generate a lot of stuff that sounds really good if no one's ever going to challenge you on it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to stop there, Doug. The two books that I read very, very carefully were How to Measure Anything and The Failure of Risk Management. I cannot recommend them highly enough. Doug, where can people find you online? How can they learn more if they're intrigued by this show?
Oh, well, the books have their own website called howtomeasureanything.com, and my books are listed there. Our company's website is hubbardresearch.com, and right on there is also the AIE Academy. So if you want to learn more about applied information economics and get into it in great detail, the AIE Academy has a whole series of courses, and we have a whole certification process and everything. So we're trying to get these ideas out into the public. We're trying to train more people to do it.
And it rewards deep study, right? This is something you mentioned before. It's not something you just sort of snap your fingers and pick up. So I encourage everybody to do that.
Well,
right?
that's true, but I will also say it's a lot easier than learning to become an actuary. It's a lot easier than being an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor. It's not rocket science. Sure, it's complicated enough that not everybody does it.
Well, it's simple.
A lot easier. It's a lot easier than things that companies do all the time.
Yes.
So
wrongly, we learn. Well, my guest today is Doug Hubbard. Doug, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time, Dave.